Welcome to video 10 in series 3, and in this video I'll go over layers and visibility. So you can use layers to affect what you can see in the scene, and you can use layers together with cameras to arrive at some interesting results. There won't be any scripting in this particular tutorial, but first of all, for layers and what's in the scene. So eventually you'll find that the UI and the scene view will be getting in the way of what you're working with, and you'll be trying to click on something and you'll end up clicking the UI. So you can change what is visible right here in the top right of the editor, and you can say, for example, UI, I'll hide that layer. So now you can continue working and you won't have the UI in the way. Alright, so that's one item. Alright, now the next one is to do with cameras. So if we look at the FPS controller, at the first-person character, this particular camera can see everything. So it can see any layer. Let me add something to the first-person character. Let me simulate, for example, if we were carrying a weapon and it was visible. Right, so I'll just push this over. I will change the scale. I'll move it forward. Okay, it's just filling up the screen right now. But I will change the scale. I'll make this 0.1. I guess I'll make this 0.1 as well. Rather, that's a mistake. How about I leave that at, say, 0.5, and I'll make this one 0.1. Okay, and move it back in. I'll just free slide it for now. Okay. Just as if it were, like, for example, you can imagine it was a gun here that the player is holding. And I'll turn off the box collider, so stuff that you have your player holding, you don't want a collider on it, otherwise you'll have problems when you're walking around. Okay, so now if I hit play, alright, I had in my previous tutorial set on that all of the enemies would be hidden, so what I'll do is, I'll just create another cube. Okay, and just, well, rather put this one out, and just change the scale. I'll just reset it. There we go. And just bring it over. Alright, that'll serve just fine for this. Okay, so now that I have this, watch what happens. Do you see how the weapon is going inside of the cube? It's a rather undesirable thing to happen. So I don't want that to happen. I want to be able to see the gun. So I don't want it when the player, whenever he walks up to a wall or something, this object then passes into the other one, right? So what you do is you do a camera trick. I'll just stop playing here. And first of all, well, you don't have to start in this order, but I need to make a new layer and place this cube. I'll just call it weapons, just for the moment, or just call it, yeah, I'll just leave it weapon, capitals, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'll just call this weapon, just so I can see what I'm talking about. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it in a new layer. So I have to add a layer, just like adding tags. And I'll write in here a name for the layer, and I'll call it weapon. So I'll go back and assign this layer to weapon. Okay. Now if I go back to the camera, which is the parent, it's on the parent game object to weapon, I can now turn off that layer. It can no longer see the weapon layer, so suddenly it becomes invisible. By the way, now this is actually quite a useful thing. You can imagine that there are some game types where you don't want to show what is actually visible in the scene. For example, perhaps you have invisible enemies until your player does something, then can see them. That is a perfect way for being able to hide them, but have them fully interactable with the player. Okay, so perhaps now I'll show you what I mean by adding another camera to view the weapon. So now this camera too can see everything. I don't want that. So one thing to note, there's something called depth on a camera. So the current one is 0. A higher number sees stuff in front. Everything in a higher number depth is rendered on top of the lower numbered depth. So this is also depth 0. I'm going to set it to 1. I want this camera to render on top of the main camera. And it won't look at the skybox. The skybox is the sky. your lowest number camera should be the one that looks at the sky, and that way everything else up above won't get hidden by the skybox, which will make sense if you just play around with that. So for this case, you set it to depth only. This is going to be my weapon camera, so I'll call it weapon camera. Okay, and I'll just set it to depth only, so it now doesn't see the skybox. And I will turn off the culling mask. I'll set it to nothing, and then I'll set it to weapon. Okay, and so that is quite set up. That is set up. Another thing to note is for a camera like this that is only observing something really close to the player, there's no need to have a far clipping plane of this large value. This is 1,000 units. It can see out of 1,000 units. Anything beyond that is not rendered by this camera, and anything closer than 0.3 units is not rendered by this camera. So you can see the effect of that. For example, if I increase this, you can see that that object is no longer getting rendered. I'll set that back down to like 0.3. In fact, it's probably more advantageous to set it to 0.1 and to set this to something like 50, maybe even less than that. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It's all set up, and I can just go in, and you can see that now, no matter what, the gun is, or the weapon is not going to go inside of the cube. Now, something I do need to do, since it's a new camera, I do need to get rid of the audio listener. There's no reason to have this on it, and I don't need these either. I didn't need to remove it. I could have just disabled it, actually. But anyway, that's it. So just remember, for your additional cameras, so you can have as many doing this sort of thing as you need. I mean, you could even have another camera that looks off into the distance as well. Now, there's a good reason why I attached the camera to the first-person character, because this game object is controlled by the first-person controller, and that allows it to rotate with the mouse, and so it just makes sense to fit this visibility camera onto that as well. So then it all looks right. Like, for example, if it's out here, well, suddenly things are not going to make any sense whatsoever, and yeah, it makes no sense whatsoever like that. So of course it has to be attached to the player, and then it makes sense. It'll move with the player, and yep, okay. Alright, so that's it. So that's the concepts that I just needed to show you, and that's it. In the next video I'll show you the same layers and physics interaction. Alright, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.